Hey guys, I'm Ted, your host, and welcome back to our lecture series. And we are going to pick things up right where we left off in our last lecture with part two of our lectures on Reconstruction. Now, before we begin our lecture proper, I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we last discussed in the first part of our lecture. Okay, so in our last lecture, we discussed the opening stages, the opening moves with Reconstruction. We touched on the Sea Islands, how the Sea Islands served as the first place where emancipation unfolded and where Reconstruction began. We also touched on the two early competing groups in terms of Reconstruction, the freedmen and the financial backers from the free states. And indeed, the commercial interest in the United States would sort of serve as a firm opponent, a firm detriment to the gains and aspirations of the freedmen during Reconstruction. The freedmen really weren't that interested in pursuing cash crop cultivation on the scale, on the pre-war scale, on this massive scale. They were primarily interested in simply feeding themselves and just engaging in subsistence farming. Whereas the former slave craft wanted to go right back into work, get right back at producing the cash crops. Financial investors from the free states and the Western territories, they wanted to invest in plantations and have access to cheap labor, really abundant cheap labor that could produce the cash crops on the massive scale, that have been experienced during the pre-war years, especially during the 1850s. These two groups clashed more often than not. We also saw the unfolding of tensions at the national level as Congress divided into different factions. You had the Democratic Party, who was opposed to any sort of change in the social relationships between the communities living in the former slave states. We saw the Republican Party fracture on the scope of reforming the former slave states, the former Confederate states. And with that being said, let's dive right into the scene in Washington as Lincoln was coming up with his own plan for Reconstruction. Now, with land and labor concerns being addressed, attention soon turned to civil and political rights. Now, the freedmen in Louisiana formed a coalition with the working class anti-secessionist element in that city, the city of New Orleans. Lincoln had hoped to avoid having to address the issues, and instead hoping that moderate slave owners would eventually take power in the states. Now, when that failed, he issued what's known as the 10% Plan in December of 1863. Now, Lincoln, in the late stages of the war, came up with this plan of action to get the rebel states readmitted into the Republic. Now, Lincoln offered a presidential pardon to any rebel who would swear allegiance to the United States. They had to swear to abide by all his presidential proclamations and the congressional legislation issued or passed relating to slavery. He did exempt certain military and civilian leaders of the Confederate government, but he then said that when 10% of the 1860 voting population in the rebel states took the oath, they could form a new state government. Now, the new government, of course, would have to recognize emancipation. He did not make any special consideration for the plight of African Americans at that time. He said that he hoped they would not leave them to be a landless laboring class, but he did not insist on any protection for them. Now, this plan is known as the 10% Plan. It called for no excessive punishments, no property qualifications, and a return to full member status in the Republic. Now, the plan has noted left the social system up to the ex-rebels, but as the prospects of victory grew, Lincoln made an additional request that limited limited enfranchisement. It stated that enfranchisement should be granted, that is, voting rights should be granted to African American soldiers and those who were intelligent. Lincoln's role in Reconstruction was, however, to be limited. Had he was assassinated, had the process was being revamped and applied to all of the rebel slave states. Now, radical Republicans attacked this plan. They attacked the 10% plan. They wanted better protections for African Americans, and they especially wanted land for the African American community. They called on the need for the freedmen to be given land so that they could support themselves. Radicals also objected to admitting the rebel states back into the Republic so leniently. They didn't feel that they should be given full member status after having committed treason. They wanted them to undergo a rebuilding process. They wanted the old order. They wanted to make sure that that old order had been broken down, and that these new states, that these states had been rebuilt with a new ethic and a new outlook, one that more closely aligned with the feeling of the rest of the nation. Now, Congress had the group oppose the 10% plan and refused to recognize the state governments organized under the 10% plan's provisions. They refused to seat elected representatives and senators sent from these states and acted on their own to bring about a reconstructed settlement. On July 2nd, 1864, Congress approved the Wade-Davis Bill, and this bill was named after Benjamin Franklin Wade and Henry Winter Davis. It called for 50% of the 1860 voters to have taken the loyalty oath to the Republic before a call for a state convention could be issued. Now, the convention members who could vote for and attend the convention were men who were only men who had taken an ironclad oath that they had not in any way supported the Confederate States. There were not a lot of men or people, for that general, in the 1860s, European Americans in the 1860s from these former slave states who could make such a boast. Lincoln saw that. Everyone else, it was the intent and the purpose of that bill to exclude many of those Confederate supporters from having a say in the formation of the governments. Lincoln used a pocket veto on this bill. That is, this bill would pass towards the end of the legislative period. Lincoln simply didn't sign the bill and let it die. This infuriated the radicals in Congress. The radicals issued what they called the Wade-Davis Manifesto on August 5th, reminding the president that his executive function was to uphold the laws Congress enacts. Lincoln ignored it, as he was accustomed to by now, the many personal attacks directed toward him. But toward the end of his life, in April of 1865, he began to show signs that he was moving closer to the position of the radical Republicans. Now, with Lincoln's assassination at the hands of John Wilkes Booth, Andrew Johnson acceded as the 17th president of the United States of the Republic. Johnson was also a target of the Booth conspiracy, of the assassination plots that unfortunately took the life of President Lincoln. He was targeted, but he survived. Now, Johnson was a former governor of Tennessee. He was a former Democrat, and he was an unrepentant racist. He very strongly believed that African Americans had no capacity for government and that they were naturally inclined to barbarism. Now, that's a direct quote from Andrew Johnson. Still, many, including the radical Republicans and African Americans, held out hope that Johnson would push for radical and stiff punishment for former slavocrats. He actually made a name for himself by ardently opposing that group throughout his political career. Andrew Johnson came from the eastern mountainous regions of Tennessee, where there wasn't any sort of like great slave owner, great slave power, or anything like that. He had been illiterate for most of his life. His wife taught him to read. He worked as a tailor. He was sort of a backwoods politician. Very good for the backwoods regions, those rural lands in Tennessee, but not so good for the bigger political picture, the bigger national political scene. Um, Johnson. Uh, Johnson exhibited animosity towards slavocrats. However, all of that animosity paled in comparison for his hatred for African Americans. When he was confronted with the choice of supporting the slavocrats or the freedmen, he easily chose the slavocrats and proved to be their greatest political champion. Now, Johnson held the belief that the rebel states never left the Republic, that secession had been illegal, therefore they did not need to be heavily reconstructed or readmitted to the Republic. Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was simple. All the former slave states had to do was 1. Ratify the 13th Amendment, 2. Nullify their secession ordinances. Once the oath of loyalty to the Republic was taken, all confiscated property, minus slave property, will be returned to ex-Confederates. Johnson exempted certain high-ranking Confederate officials and the largest and the wealthiest of the slavocrats. But these men could simply petition Johnson personally. Now, Johnson overwhelmingly approved all of those who petitioned him. And under Johnson, the former slavocrats moved quickly, regaining possession of their lands and also regaining political power. In the case of freedmen who had bought confiscated lands, Johnson ordered them off the land. Many moved to towns. Many of the freedmen, they simply moved to towns, or they retreated away from large plantations to secluded areas where they practiced subsistence farming. For those caught up in the need for cheap labor, they insisted on pulling women from the field, cutting the labor force in hand. So those who couldn't get away, they stayed and they provided that cheap labor, but they still exercised a bit of power that they had never exercised before, still offsetting these social arrangements by pulling their females from the field, more closely aligning them with the practices of the Republic, of the contemporary Republic. Now, to counter the freedmen's resistance, Johnson backed the state governments, which were largely administered, as I said earlier, by slavocrats and their allies. And they began to pass the first of what's called the Black Codes. These codes were modifications on the legal statutes that governed the behavior of freedmen and slaves before the Civil War. In many instances, the word slave was merely substituted with the word Negro. The Black Codes virtually brought slavery back to life, and it horrified both freedmen, African Americans who were freed by the U.S. Civil War, and freemen, African Americans who were freed prior to the war. The most odious aspect of the Black Codes concerned vagrancy, which was so poorly defined that it made any African American who was not engaged in work at that very moment subject to arrest and detention. The vagrant would then be assessed fines that could not be realistically paid and tried and then hired out to former masters or just any member of the community who needed labor and would agree to pay the fine for them. In some states, the codes mandated working conditions such as long hours and such as long daily hours and a long term of basically servitude to pay back the loan. And to prevent escape to cities and other states, license laws were passed, which restricted African Americans to plantations, much like slaves had been restricted. To hold in a regular job, that is a job off the plantation, an African American had to apply for a license. Now, the new laws made it even necessary for African Americans to live and function much more closely under the control of members of the European American community than they had under slavery. Now, on June 13th, 1866, the 14th Amendment was passed by both houses. Now, the 14th Amendment stipulated that all native-born Americans, including African Americans, were citizens. Anybody born in the United States is an American citizen, basically. The amendment also prohibited any state from denying any person life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. It also guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment also barred many ex-Confederates from holding office at the state and federal level. It was made explicit that any state that ratified the amendment will be admitted to the Union. Tennessee ratified it in July of 1866 and was readmitted to the Union. Now, Andrew Johnson declared the amendment unconstitutional, and he now took bold steps toward creating a conservative party made up of conservative Republicans, sorry about that, and Democrats. Johnson now began to envision a political power base for himself. Now, this exacerbated the tensions between the president and Congress. He was not a Republican. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was a Democrat before the war, and he saw the Southern Democrats as his natural political allies. He agreed with many of their policies. He didn't really get along with the railroads or the Western settlement plans of the Republicans. He didn't really understand the internal improvements or the fiscal program that the Republicans were putting into place. He didn't really back any of that. He was more closely in line with the politics of Andrew Johnson than anything else. So he naturally drifted towards those Southern Democrats. He began to make overtures to them to form a political vehicle that he could then use to win re-election in 1868. Now, Johnson's effort at party building failed, and they failed miserably. His so-called party, the National Union Party, was a party that was made up of mainly Democrats, or top-heavy with Democrats. And the Democrats who filled his ranks alienated the Republicans who orbited toward that party. Now, Johnson also provoked provocation with the moderate Republicans. Now, as I stated earlier, Johnson was a backwoods politician. He was from the backwoods regions of Tennessee. And in that political world, it was a take no prisoners political world. When you debated with your political opponents, you attacked them viciously, you attacked them savagely. And whoever was left standing was obviously the guy that was going to win. He lacked the tact that Lincoln effortlessly demonstrated. Johnson's actions were deplored by the Republican Party. He succeeded in uniting all three factions, the radicals, the moderates, and the conservatives, who were more than weary by the ease by which former Confederates were allowed to resume their positions of power. Now, in the West and in the North, there was mounting anger and shock at the sight of former Confederates returning almost effortlessly to their previous positions of power. Now, Johnson's plan served to outrage both the radical and moderate factions of the Republicans, but there was largely nothing they could do. Until the passage of the 20th Amendment in 1933, Congress observed a lengthy recess during its second year. Congress wouldn't meet again. The current Congress wouldn't meet again until December of 1865. So Johnson had full reign to do as he pleased with the anti-freedmen, to do what he had he pleased with his anti-freedmen allies. And as the Republican Congress watched what was happening, a consensus grew among that body that Congress should be the only power in Washington in control of Reconstruction. Now, this was not a new opinion. Members of Congress had come to the conclusion after Lincoln issued a 10% plan. The Wade-Davis bills were Congress' first attempt at Reconstruction. The bill took Lincoln's plan and really just added to it, permanently disenfranchising high-ranking Confederate officials, requiring an ironclad loyalty treaty by mail stipulating that they had never taken up arms against the Republic, which, as I stated earlier, virtually none could do. Lincoln was opposed to it. As he was opposed to not only the plan but also to Congress's intrusion, and he really wanted to accomplish Reconstruction quickly. He wanted it done as quickly as possible. He understood that the quicker it was done, the better it would be for the Republic, nationally, but not really socially. By December of 1865, the Republicans were ready to make their mark on Reconstruction, though still divided over what course of action to take in regards to the Reconstruction settlement. They were united in opposition to the seating of the delegates sent from the former slave states, chiefly Alexander Hamilton Stevens, who had been the Confederate States Vice President and was now a newly elected, or should I say newly appointed, senator from Georgia. Next, after rejecting those delegates, Congress moved to rectify Johnson's land policy. Congress passed a modified Homestead Act that opened up 45 million acres to anyone who cultivated 80 acres. Now, Congress followed this up with a showdown with Johnson in February of 1866. Now, we'll break here and end our second part, and we'll continue our lecture series in our third lecture on Reconstruction. But before I go, I want to thank you all for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture on Reconstruction. As I stated earlier, Reconstruction is still a very controversial period in American history. There are a lot of proponents for it, but also a lot of detractors for it. So as always, hit the comments and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for part 3.